Good morning. It is filled to the brim, and it is Saturday, July 29th, and I want to give a big happy birthday to my mom. She is 80 years old today, but she is so young in spirit and so young in body. And Mom, I love you. I appreciate you. I appreciate your investment in me and your mentoring and your love, and you're priceless to me, as I hope you know. So happy birthday, Mom. The other thing I want to say is we're going to take a little hiatus for about a week. I have some ministry to do that I won't allow me to be taping. And so I will return on Tuesday, August 8th. So we'll be back in August 8th, but there's so much that you can revisit. Listen, this message on spiritual grit, wow, it's challenging me. If it doesn't challenge you, one thing I have to say about Fill to the Brims, if you're not challenged, well, that's okay, because I surely am. I'm surely growing. So it's worth it. It's always worth it. Well, we're talking about spiritual grit, and it has to do with having courage and resolve and strength of character. And we've talked about many aspects to spiritual grit. We've got to deny ourselves. We can't depend on the physical realm. We've got to remove our dependence upon the physical realm. Yesterday I talked about how Elisha prayed for his servant that he would see in the spirit realm what God was doing, the greater thing that was available to him, which created courage, which created the strength, the resolve to stand against his enemies. Today I want to talk about spiritual grit as I conclude this, is having to go where you don't want to go. Now, I talked about Jesus having to go to the cross, and when he communicated with his disciples, they understood who Jesus was. They understood, they had just proclaimed, Peter had just declared that he was the Messiah. And yet, when Jesus begins right after to talk about going to the cross and paying the price, Peter does not want to hear that. And Jesus is very firm and very clear with Peter. He says in a very significant use of terminology, "Get behind me, Satan," because it was Peter's concern and fears and all the things in his human flesh. The enemy was trying to direct Jesus and to discourage him and maybe even delay his obedience. Whatever it was, he was trying to get him in agreement with something, and Jesus did not at all entertain that. Today I want to talk about going where you don't want to go. Jesus, we find out, he later prays in Gethsemane, "Father, if you can remove this cup from me." He didn't want to go. In his human desire, he didn't want to go, but he had the spiritual grit. He had the obedience. His eyes were way beyond the physical realm. He looked into what this work was going to do for humanity, past, present, and future. Resolving to go where you don't want to go. Resolve to go. Jesus had resolved to go to the cross. And we, as his followers, many times have to resolve to go where we don't want to go. A good example in the Old Testament of a righteous man was Daniel. Daniel was, in a sense, trafficked. He was trafficked. He was a Jewish young man who was in Babylon, was taken from his homeland and placed in the palace of Babylon, and God raised him up there. God used him there. God used the difficult circumstance. I'm sure he would have rather been with his family in a world that he loved and known, and a culture that he loved and known, and yet he was placed in a very pagan culture. He had to go, even as a very young teenager, into a world he, I'm sure, had not wanted to go, and yet he resolved to honor the Lord in this. We see in Daniel's life, though, as it progresses, that he also has to resolve to go to other places he doesn't want to go, places that where his life is at risk. And we know the story. It's a very popular story where Daniel is going to go into the lion's den because of his faith. And there was a decree. There was people that didn't like Daniel, didn't like the favor that Daniel had. And so they made up this little scheme to defeat Daniel. and they tricked the king who loved Daniel into creating a decree that anybody that worshiped anyone but him and their gods would be killed. And here we have Daniel, who learns about this decree in Daniel 6, verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. This is a powerful verse, because here you have Daniel who, it says, I learned of this decree. I learned of what the physical realm had dictated to me, and my response was, I go and I pray. I'm still committed. I have resolved to be committed to the Lord. I have resolved to have him number one, no matter what the physical realm is dictating. In verse 16, we find, so the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. He goes to a place where he doesn't want to go. The place is the lion's den. I'm sure he didn't go happily. I'm sure in the sense he was, a little overwhelmed in it all, but he had the grit. He had the resolve. The beautiful part of the story, and we know it, it's a very popular story, is that the Lord protects him. The Lord protects him to show forth his glory. So here you have Daniel going somewhere he doesn't want to go. At the same time, God says, I'm going to bring you to the lion's den to show forth my glory. Daniel 6, verse 20 through 22. And when the king came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Daniel responds to a very terrible, terrifying situation with spiritual grit. It was not a place he wanted to go, but he went, and God was with him. We will go to places we do not want to go. That's part of spiritual grit. Jesus even says this to Peter later. This is right after Jesus says to Peter, restores Peter and says, Peter, do you love me? 3 times he asked Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, I love you. Then he goes in. This is what Jesus says to Peter. John 21, verse 18. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. What is Jesus talking about? Jesus is talking about Peter and being his death as a martyr. He's prophesying to Peter. He's letting Peter know this is going to be your death. Now, if you read the book of Acts, you'll find Peter also went to other places he didn't want to go, like to jail. There's stories about that as well. Part of our journey is that we're going to go places that our physical human flesh does not want to go. It's interesting, if you know church history, have read church history, that 10 of Christ's disciples died a martyr's death, of his original disciples. The ones that didn't was Judas. We know that he committed suicide because he betrayed Jesus. And then John the beloved, lived out a long life, and he died a natural death of old age. But 10 died a martyr's death. They went to places, I'm sure, they had rather chosen not to go. But they went to those places because they had the spiritual grit, that resolve to serve the Lord, to honor the Lord. So much to say about spiritual grit. We've got to trust his timing, accept his ways. Part of spiritual grit is saying, Lord, I accept the way you're going to do something, and I accept your timing, even if I've prayed differently. We kind of visited that a little bit with Paul when he asked God to take away the thorns. But we know that what Scripture says to us about the Lord. Isaiah 55:8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and thoughts than your thoughts. So we know this. Listen, even in the trajectory of our learning and knowing Him and being developed and being made like Him, we still don't capture everything about God. The infinite God, the all-knowing God, the all-powerful God, the sovereign God. And we accept, as part of the spiritual grit, we accept His timing may be different in the situation. His ways may be different in our situation. I want to leave it with this. You know what? Spiritual grit reveals God's favor in our lives. See, He doesn't have spiritual grit, wants us to have spiritual grit, resolve, confidence, determination that comes from His power to fulfill what He's asked us to do, to obey, to live for Him, to be rooted and grounded in Him. Spiritual grit actually reveals His favor in our lives. Let me read this as our last scripture. Galatians 3:7-9. So understand that it is the people who live by faith. Remember, we talked about Abraham and Sarah. So understand that it is the people who live by faith who are sons of Abraham. The scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith proclaimed the good news to Abraham in advance with this promise, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. Verse 9. So then, those who are people of faith are blessed and favored by God. So those of us who walk by faith and not by sight are blessed and favored by God. It's not a tragic place to be in. It's not a terrible place to be in. It's a beautiful place to be in. We're blessed. We're favored by God. There is a reward to spiritual grit. There is a reward. Scripture says in Hebrews, listen, Hebrews 10:36-39. One more scripture. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what He has promised. For in just a little while, He who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. But we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. We have spiritual grit. We do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. You are blessed and favored by God. Just like Paul the Apostle was blessed and favored by God. Just like Daniel was blessed and favored by God. Just like Elisha and his servant were blessed and favored by God. Just like Sarah and Abraham were blessed and favored by God. Just like the people in Hebrews chapter 11 were blessed and favored by God. You are blessed and favored by God. Even when you have to go where you don't want to go. Even when you have to depend upon the spiritual things, the spiritual realm and not the physical realm. Even when you have to accept God's timing, God's ways, you are blessed and favored by God. Even when you are denying yourself, picking up your cross and following Him, you are blessed and favored by God. Why? Because that's when you find your life. That's when you find your life. I want to encourage you. Spiritual grit. You've got it. Let God grow it. God bless you.